Puso na tanaway maknak uska pawas na aspician na toto manua iyawat awasa Menominee inani ni shikni na tawam katman uskiktim. I said thank you. I welcome everybody here, all my relatives. My name is Gary Besaw. That's how I pay my taxes. And my real name that I pray every morning, and I hope we all do, because there is a creator, is Oskar Powis, and that's in our language a messenger or translator. And my clan is Bear Clan, and in Bear Clan, I am a speaker and keeper of the law. So it's within those realms that I agree to come forward many times to assist in some of the tribal perspectives. And you need to know I do not represent the Menominee tribe, the Menominee Nation in everything I say. But I'm very, very, very pleased to be here today. And I would like to introduce our panelists to let you know the wealth and breadth of what we have here today. And I'm going to start at the end, and please bear with me. I know if we go to wisconsin.edu/climate policy to view the online program and for a link to the live closed caption of this panel's discussion, and we can come back to those. So I'm going to start though to show you what we have here today. We'll start to my left, your right, with Thea Whitman. She is an associate professor, UW-Madison, Department of Soil Science. Thea Whitman's research is in soil biogeochemistry and microbiology, and includes an emphasis on soil carbon cycling, wildfires, and pyrogenic organic matter or biochar. Her publications include consideration of greenhouse gas accounting in renewable biomass systems, incorporation of biochar into carbon accounting mechanisms, and the potential of biochar to contribute to climate change mitigation, in addition to lab and field research on soil microbiology and biogeochemistry. Her lab's research is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Science Foundation, and other sources. Yeah. Next, we go to Rebecca Webster. She is an assistant professor, Department of American Indian Studies, University of Minnesota-Duluth. Rebecca Webster is an enrolled citizen of the United Nations whose research interests focus on tribal governance and food sovereignty. Her philosophy is that every time an indigenous person plants a seed, that is an act of resistance, an assertion of sovereignty, and a reclamation of identity. Webster previously served the United Nations as an attorney, providing legal advice for the nation's administration on government relations, jurisdiction concerns, and a wide variety of tribal land issues. In addition to her academic interests, she grows heirloom traditional foods with her family on their 10-acre farmstead, and with her other group. This is in Oneida, don't expect me to say it. But it's called Among the Corn Stalks. And it really is a great community garden effort. It is a co-op of Oneida families that grow Iroquois white corn together. Rebecca. And finally, we have Randy Romanski, Secretary, Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Randy Romanski was named to lead DATCAP by Governor Tony Evers in June 2020. He served as Deputy Secretary from January 2019 to November 2019, when he was named Interim Secretary. Under Governor Jim Doyle, Romanski served as DATCAP's Deputy Secretary and Secretary, working on issues such as farmland preservation, local foods, the Farm to School program, and renewable energy. He has also served as the executive assistant for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and Wisconsin Department of Transportation, and as the Safety Program Chief in DOT's Division of State Patrol. A Wisconsin native, Romanski grew up in Wisconsin Rapids and earned his bachelor's degree in political science from UW River Falls. He also has a master's degree from the Follette School of Public Affairs. This is our team. So we will start then with a 5 minute. First, I would probably, it would pay to let you know our format so you understand it. We will be giving 5 minutes for each of our panelists to give those perspectives on their interpretation based off the expertise that they have. Remember, we are looking at research, data, evidence, and experience in how we can work to describe and to help slow the impact of, and maybe even go backwards in some of the carbon and climate issues. So I'm going to give them each 5 minutes to give that perspective so we can see some of that expertise and their view of where we are at. So I'll start with Thea.
Sure. Thanks, Gary. And thanks to the other panelists too. I'm really excited to be sitting up here with this group. Yeah, I won't speak too long. Gary gave a really great introduction to what I work on, which is broadly understanding how do we get more carbon in the ground instead of being in the atmosphere where it's contributing to climate change. And so what that looks like is thinking about increasing soil organic matter, which has all sorts of co-benefits in terms of its impacts on soil. And I've also done work in the area of biochar, which I think we might talk a little bit about more later, so I won't get into too much detail now. But yeah, I think negative emissions are and the agricultural links to climate change are really interesting and exciting because so many of the solutions have co-benefits. It's not just dumping carbon below ground and sequestering it and never seeing it again. It's what it comes along with and the other benefits that it has when you have more organic matter in the soil. So I'll be looking forward to talking about that today and thinking about some of these solutions together.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Sa goy swagwake, ganyat the gay loon yunget, some gwe huene. Becky Webster and yungets oats lunige. Wagwaho ni wigit to load, oneti aga ni wagadu humajot, dolunkawane ni wagenu. So in English, what I just said is greetings, everybody. My name is Ganyet Gay, which means snow scattered here and there. My English name is Becky Webster. I am Wolf Clan. I'm Oneida, and I grew up near Duck Creek that runs through the Oneida Reservation. So as Gary mentioned, a little bit about my background. I'll tell you a little bit about our farmstead. We have a 10-acre farmstead where our goals are to revitalize our seeds in our community, our indigenous heirloom seeds that had belonged to Haudenosaunee people, of which the Oneida are a part of. We focus on heirloom crops such as corn, beans, and squash, planting them together, tobacco, sunflower, sunchokes, and just different seeds and foods that our people had originally taken care of and had a relationship with. We wanted to share with people those seeds themselves, the whole process of planting them, caring for them as they grow, harvesting them, preserving them, and cooking them. And with those goals in mind, an Oneida Faith Keeper named our property Ungwakwat Jitnuni Ungwayaya Toslu. It means our foods, where we plant things. I'm also part of a 10-member co-op called Ohilagu, which is among the corn stalks, which we care for about 6 acres of our corn together as a family. Those are a little bit more conventional methods. So while most of my focus is on the traditional agricultural methods, we do have a little bit of familiarity with larger scale farming, but not large scale like you see the few hundred acres, just a few acres at a time. Thank you.
Thank you. And Secretary Romanski, Randy.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. I'm Randy Romanski, Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. As Gary mentioned, I am also a proud alum of the Follette Institute. And I think it's tremendously important that Follette has a focus on improving the lives of the people of Wisconsin and beyond. These conversations are good examples of how we can all do that. I'll just start off by saying agriculture is a $104.8 billion industry for the state of Wisconsin. So as we're here talking about agriculture and negative emissions, that's central to the discussion for today. The other thing that I like to say is agriculture is part of our state's past, present, and future, a vitally important part of our state's economy. At DACAP, our mission is to be a resource to the industry, a resource to citizens, a resource to the public. And we offer programs that aid our state's agriculture industry, but relying heavily on partnerships to get that done. And we focus on practices that try to make a big difference on important issues like soil and water health and climate change. The focus that I'm talking about is connecting to two of our conversation's goals today, which are collaboration and solutions. The science is clear. Our climate is changing. And it's still changing. And our state's agriculture industry is seeing and recognizing, and I say is central to making changes so that we can see improvements in what's going on. I believe that any conversation about mitigating the impacts of climate change should include our state's agriculture industry. Wisconsin needs its agricultural land more than ever to provide food, fiber, fuel for our state, nation, and world. Our state's economy rests on the foundation of agriculture. And again, I think protecting Wisconsin's farmland is incredibly important. Having farmers be part of the conversation about how to mitigate impacts is also very important. I know we'll touch on some of those things later, but I just wanted to say that I'm pleased to join Gary, Becky, and Thea on the panel today. And as Gary indicated, we hope to bring our perspectives to this and hope to have an engaging conversation with you all. Back to you, Gary.
Thank you, Randy. So here's our format. We have a 40-minute panel questions that I have already locked and loaded. We will ask those. And then we have 15 minutes for the audience Q&A. So within that, the forum themes are research, data, evidence, and experience. We can come from those realms. We would also like to hear innovative models and of course, collaboration and solution orientated. Before I ask my first question, I would like to acknowledge the Ho-Chunk people who this is their ancestral territory. And I thank them for allowing my footprints on their land. This state of Wisconsin that we call, and this is why I've come forward and agreed to do this. I've been told I'm very passionate, but it's because this is Menominee's original homeland, this what we now call the state of Wisconsin. It comes from a word from our language, Wiscosik, that means a good place to live. That's good water, good air, good medicines, and I like to say a pretty darn good football team. So with that, we will go to our questions that I have locked and loaded. And here's the first one. And this is for Becky. Others may chime in here, but we will predominantly go to individuals first for that question. Becky, how has climate change impacted agriculture in Wisconsin? And why is agriculture so crucial in addressing climate change?
Thanks, Gary. So when I first saw this question, I thought, holy cats, that's a huge question, right? How are you going to answer that in 5 minutes and let alone Wisconsin as a whole? So I Googled it real quick just to see what are other people talking about. And what came up first was it reduces the yields and lowers livestock productivity. So those are two of the things that Google is telling us happens with climate change. So those aren't really things that I've particularly noticed. I'm still a relatively new farmer. We just pulled in our 7th year of harvest. So all of these things are new to me and many other people in our community. We are in a revitalization, so to speak, of reclaiming our indigenous foods and being able to grow and care for them the way we did historically. So as part of that history, we have to think of the Thanksgiving address, the Ganahela Dunksla. And what that does is we say that opening before any important gatherings. And what it does is it recognizes the interrelationship between everything in creation. We all have a responsibility to each other. And if you look at what's going on, and especially our traditional ceremonies, they all follow the changes of the seasons. So it's not like, oh, on December 7th, this will happen, or you can't plan ahead for it necessarily. You have to watch for the changes of the seasons. So climate change is affecting these things when they happen. So for example, we have certain ceremonies that you have to complete before the oak leaf is bigger than a squirrel's ear, just different timing things that are happening. And we've noticed that they're hard to predict. We don't know when things are going to happen. So the sturgeon ran 3 weeks earlier this past year than they did the year before. And we use fish in our agricultural practices. And if the timing is off, when you can't get the fish locally, we get suckers from Duck Creek to put into our mounds. But if you can't time that right, you're not going to get them in the ground by the time it's ready to plant, because they have run weeks ahead of time before you were even ready. So those are the types of things that we're noticing. We are also having to choose shorter growing season seeds because of our relatively short growing season and the unpredictability of it all. So it's more than just, people say, global warming. It's the unpredictability, because if you put those seeds in the ground too early and they sprout and it freezes, they die. But if you wait too long, you don't know if they'll have a chance to fully mature before you can harvest, and your crops can be in danger. So our traditional practices work with the environment and work on soil health, whereas the conventional practices, like, they'll try to get the water off the land as quickly as possible. And sure, we'll have buffers in there, but still, if you look at those conventional practices, that they can endanger the environment. I'm sure some of us will be talking about the ways that we can improve those practices. But when looking at our traditional agricultural practices, we plant them together in mounds, and our focus is never on yield. It's on the health of the plants, the health of the people, and the celebrations that come when our seeds produce for us.
Thank you. So let's move to question number 2. Now, if we have comments, this is as a discussion with our panelists. If we have comments, just let me know, and we'll work that into it. Because I know with our specialists here, with the breadth of experience they have, easily they could add into this. So by all means. So we'll move to our second question. How does Wisconsin's agriculture industry view its role in addressing climate change, and what steps are being taken to make Wisconsin farms more sustainable? Randy?
Thank you, Gary. I think it's fair to say that agriculture considers itself to be central in the discussion of climate change and being a part of mitigating impacts. The Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection has a 9-member citizen board that meets almost monthly. And at one of our meetings, I asked the 9 board members what their thoughts were on climate change, and each one of them indicated that they thought it would be difficult to look at the recent weather events that we've seen, the dramatic swings, the impacts that we've seen, the droughts out west, and actually even here in the Midwest, and think that our climate is not changing. Those same members also indicated that farmers and agriculture organizations are looking at themselves to be part of the solutions that can help mitigate and hopefully change some of those impacts. Governor Evers created a climate change task force shortly after he took office. And we were fortunate from the department standpoint to be able to be on that panel, as was Gary. And there were also 4 members from agricultural organizations that were included as well, which was great because they got to sit alongside people from tribal nations, from industry, from the utility industry, from conservation groups, citizens. And a good example of how they view, just getting back to the original question of how does agriculture view its role. Here's a couple of excerpts from some of those members. Robert Nye, who's a Farm Bureau member from Southwest Wisconsin, said Wisconsin farmers are proud of their continuing efforts to use climate smart practices, including producer-led watershed groups, cover crops, and utilizing no-till and reduce tillage of fields. We feel we've been at the forefront of flood and erosion control, protection and conservation, and preservation of water quality and other innovations. That's what people are doing, and they continue to do more. Doug Rebout, who's president of the Wisconsin Corn Growers Association, said he was encouraged as part of his role on the climate change task force to see how productive the conversations were amongst this diverse group of participants. And he was honored by the fact that agriculture was not only at the table, but contributing solutions to climate change impacts. Farmers are stewards of their land. The land they till, use for crop production, the water they use for the animals in their homes is the water and land that's shared with their neighbors and people downstream. It's part of their livelihood, and it's important that they play a primary role in conserving those resources and improving those resources. They also are working with many food businesses and corporations to develop sustainability and carbon goals. They're part of those discussions at different levels to promote sustainability. Some steps that are being taken. I think I mentioned a few of them already, but and I'm guessing they'll come up in many instances today. But from cover crops to producer-led watershed programs, where farmers are working with their neighbors to develop solutions in their backyard about soil and water conservation efforts, is really important, because what works in Southwest Wisconsin in the driftless area is going to be a different solution than in the karst topography in eastern Wisconsin, or the Anago silt loam in north central Wisconsin, to the central sands in central Wisconsin. It's important that we engage farmers, that we engage county conservation staff, that they engage us as an agency to develop those solutions that work in their backyard, because their backyard is all of our backyards. I guess I'll just wrap up this question by just talking a little bit about resiliency. Building the resiliency of our states and our nation's farms is really going to be key to mitigating the impacts of climate change, because we can help with that from the state's level by increasing the technical service resources that we have access to, that they have access to through us. This gets back to us being a resource to the industry, to the citizens. We have to prepare our agricultural professionals to address increasing plant pest and disease pressure that comes along with a warming climate. Becky was talking about some of the impacts of cooler winters, longer summers, and one of them is pests could overwinter more easily. We're going to have to address that as a citizenry and farmers as agriculturalists, as conservationists. So those are a few things that I would point to as, how does agriculture see its role, and what are some steps they're taking?
Thank you. And that brought up to me the Menominee Reservation is 250,000 acres. It's also Menominee County, and it's about an hour northwest of Green Bay, of Lambeau Field, I always say. And our foresters tell us that the sustainable forest that we have is such a beautiful salad bowl that invasives are slowly moving up. And once they hit that canopy, and it's an undisturbed canopy, it covers the entire forest. A squirrel can go follow the canopy from one side of the reservation to the other without touching the ground. So we have those types of concerns also with us. And those are talking about something that's maybe easy to understand as the forest, but that also plays out in our agricultural fields. And it also follows other types of highways, which would be our waterways. And and our connected wetlands. So thank you. Those are all deep concerns that Menominee and everyone in this room has. So thank you. So Thea, help our audience understand how negative emissions differ from simply reducing emissions, and what specific considerations are important for negative emissions.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm going to get just super basic here for a minute, and hopefully that's helpful. Please don't be insulted. So starting from the principle, right, global warming is caused by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? And the more greenhouse gases there are, the more warming we'll have effectively. And two things are controlling how many greenhouse gases are present in the atmosphere. The first obvious one is the emissions. And so that's the rate at which we're burning fossil fuels, things like land use change, those sorts of things are increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so that's the first element. And I'll say just, as a note, we are here on the agriculture and negative emissions panel. We should probably note that in order to truly address climate change, fundamentally, what we have to do is dramatically reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's exciting talking about these solutions and the way that agriculture is part of it. But at the same time, we also need to keep that in mind. This isn't going to, we aren't going to be able to continue to emit at the rate that we are. Agriculture isn't going to save us in continuing on sort of our current trajectory. That said, there's a lot of really awesome things that ag can do. And so we have our first element, which is the rate at which emissions are being released into the atmosphere. And then the second thing that controls what's there is the rate at which they're removed. And so there are natural processes through which greenhouse gases are removed. Sometimes it's just chemistry in the atmosphere, oxidation, transformation of these compounds into other molecules that aren't greenhouse gases. But one of the key methods, of course, of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and particularly if we're thinking about CO2, is photosynthesis. So when plants grow, they take CO2 out of the atmosphere, it becomes part of their biomass. And then in the natural cycle, eventually they'll decompose and it goes back to the atmosphere. And so in that case, you're not looking at negative emissions. That's sort of a neutral cycle. And so where you begin to get the idea of negative emissions or a net reduction is when something else happens to those greenhouse gases once they're out of the atmosphere. And there are all sorts of different places they can go. So one would be into the soil, sticking around in the soil for longer than they would have in the past. They can be transformed into forms that are more stable, so they decompose more slowly. That's like biochar, which I think we'll again talk a bit more about later. And so those are just sort of two examples. We can also think about non-biological ways of drawing down emissions. Those would be essentially chemical processes where we're capturing CO2 directly from the air and storing it somewhere. And that's an area outside of my own expertise, but I should note that's another potential source of negative emissions. And so coming back to sort of just that big picture, we know that we need to reduce emissions. That's one of our primary goals. But the fact remains that there are already greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and they're going to remain there for sort of a certain natural amount of time if we only are relying on natural processes to remove them. And so that's where negative emissions could potentially play a role, given that we ideally are rapidly drawing down the amount of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide that's in the atmosphere. And particularly thinking about how we might need to be doing that in the shorter term to get us back below the levels that we're at today. So then for the second part of that question, I guess, just things that we need to think about in that context. One of the big questions, so often when we're thinking about the biological side of negative emissions, we need to also think about what I like to call the baseline scenario. So what would have happened to this plant or this biomass if we hadn't used it to say, if it's sort of in a bioenergy context or being used to produce biochar, we need to think about what would have happened to this in the first place to ensure that we're truly producing a net reduction in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we're not just sort of shifting them to somewhere else in the system. And so when we're thinking about these sorts of approaches, a systems thinking approach is always really important to think about, are we just displacing emissions or are we truly reducing them at a global scale? So hopefully that's a little bit of helpful. context.
Yes, thank you, Thea. So back to you, Becky. How are farmers altering agricultural practices to adapt to the changing climate? And how can these practices be applied to the agriculture industry at large?
So thanks, Gary. So in general, what we're trying to do on our farmstead is revert back to our traditional agricultural practices, our original instructions. How did our ancestors tell us that we needed to be growing our crops together? And predominantly it's this buzzword, what is it? A companion planting. Well, we call that the three sisters. It's part of our creation story. They're the corn, beans, and squash growing together, sometimes sunflowers, and it doesn't always have to be those three. We recognize that different plants have relationships with other plants and they rely on each other. That's just the foundational principle of how everything is interrelated. So we try to do no till, no herbicides, no pesticides. We want to try to get to a point where we're not using any machinery at all in our farmstead. We have to rely on the fish for the fertilizer and potentially some neighbors' manure a bit just to give it a little bit of a kickstart. Because when we purchased the property that we have, we had some soil testing done and it was conventionally farmed before we got it and had rested for about 10 years. And even though it rested for about 10 years, those soil tests showed just how damaged that soil was. It was really sad to see what a state it was in. But with our practices that we're trying to do to build up the soil, we have still, those plants are still giving and they're still producing, which is just so generous on their part to be able to do so, even though they're not yet at optimal conditions. So other things that we do is we save our seeds. Instead of waiting till the following year to go buy your seeds from somewhere, it's our seeds because we recognize that those are our relatives and they've been passed down for generation to generation to generation, and that we're wanting to return those in the hands of our community members to reinvigorate those relationships. So one of the things that we're doing is we're blending a bit of the traditional teachings with our modern teachings in a number of ways. The first way is last year we built a high tunnel. And that was a real adventure. If anyone's ever tried to build one of these by yourself, it's really an adventure, let me just say. So it's a 30 by 90 high tunnel. And what we did is we put mounds inside of the high tunnel so that we could extend the season out, so that we could have a little bit more predictability and control of the environment. We didn't have to worry about windstorms. We could control how much rain went in there. We could control the temperature a bit with the shade cloth and the rolling down of the sides. And we could plant a whole month moon cycle ahead of the plants that we planted everywhere else. So that's one way that we're trying to learn how to adjust our practices. One of the other ways is actually in our conventional fields with our co-op. So we're trying, we generally plant in two places at least each year. One of them is very conventional, though it's organic practices. We get the field ready with tractors. We plant with a tractor, we cultivate with a tractor for a bit, and then after that, everything is done by hand. We hand weed, we hand harvest, we hand husk, we hand braid all of the corn. And in one of the other fields, we're also trying to use, we use conventional practices, but we're trying different things with cover crops and interseeding methods with the crimper rollers, all these other different things. We're still relatively new to this, though we're trying different things each year to look at the productivity and comparing our fields and how this is working, because not that we necessarily are overly concerned with the yield. We just want to get to a point where we can demonstrate that farming in this manner can be as effective as farming in the conventional manner when you're talking about heirloom seeds, which are very different from the GMO seeds that most of our farmers are growing around us. So that's a bit of an ongoing experiment, and we're learning, and we're hoping to share our results when in the future when we get down better methods for how to go about doing that.
Okay, thank you, Becky. So a lot of this, and that's great to hear, because many tribes across America are also looking at returning to their roots and some of the indigenous practices that they have done. But with that, a lot of that comes back to some initial startups, and those are on a smaller scale. So there is intrepidation with some of the larger producers on startup costs and return on investment impacts of making that type of switch. Can you speak to some of that, Randy?
Sure, thanks, Gary. And what I would say is that for the most part, much of the toolbox that farmers need to have available to have impacts on greenhouse gas emissions and increase their carbon storage is really already compiled. So that's a good thing. Practices that we've been seeing implemented at a greater and greater activity in recent times continues to grow, but some of those practices are pretty well established. So I mentioned a couple of them already, but no-till is becoming more prevalent. Cover crops is becoming a much more utilized approach, not just for soil conservation, but also for carbon sequestration. Nutrient management planning to actually reduce inputs, establishing pollinator habitat, and going back to some of that soil and water conservation ethos that our farmers in Wisconsin have. Those are practices that are already there, they're in place, but it's the utilization of those things that we're seeing on a greater level, and the understanding that they contribute not only to the localized benefit of, in some cases, increasing production because of better utilization of land, but also doing so in a more sustainable way and sequestering carbon. And some of that gets to not only the co-benefits that I think, Becky, I don't know if you mentioned that or if Thea mentioned it earlier, but it gets to that issue of benefits beyond just the localized impact, where we can start to move towards negative emissions in some cases.
Thank you. Okay, Thea, we've talked about biochar, and again, this is an ancient practice that was used by ancient agriculturists, including the Menominee, on the Menominee River on the border between Wisconsin and Upper Michigan. And at one time, Western scientists told us it's too sophisticated to have raised garden beds this far north. It can't be done. Well, we proved that it was, and that was one of the types of practices that we had used. So we are very interested in hearing your take on this. So, Thea, what are some of the most compelling farming practices like biochar you have seen to help address climate change? Also, please explain what these practices are and how they work.
Sure, yeah. I mean, maybe I'll start with the broader one, which is just increasing the amount of carbon in soil. And so we know that there's actually a lot of carbon in soils. People are sometimes surprised, but there's more carbon in soil than there is in plants and the atmosphere combined. So this is a really massive stock. And it's not a static stock either. There's 60 gigatons of carbon going in every year and 60 gigatons coming out. To put that in perspective, anthropogenic emissions are about 10 gigatons. So this flow is very large and it's dynamic. And the difference is that it's largely in balance, right? So about the same amount is going in as is coming out. And it's where our management, we can tweak that balance, right? And so we can, if we tweak it in one way, we end up with more coming out than is going in, which is a bad thing for climate change. But we also know that there are ways that we can add more carbon to the soil than is being removed. And so putting that in sort of just super simple terms again, what's determining what goes in? It's literally plants, right? So the plants are photosynthesizing, they die, they rot, this carbon is in the soil, the roots are turning over, the leaves, that sort of thing. So that's how you increase carbon in soil. And so you can think on that end about things like what Becky and Randy have both been talking about, things like diversification of cropping systems, cover crops, interseeding, that sort of thing, making sure that the land is covered and you've always got carbon going into the soil. The other hand of that equation is what's coming out. And that's sort of where more of my own expertise is, which is in the microbes, because it's actually the microbes in the soil that are munching away, just the same way that we all just had lunch and we consumed organic matter and we breathed out CO2, right? And microbes are literally doing the same thing, only they're eating the dead plant matter. They're eating that soil organic matter. So on that end, we can think about things that we can do that, might make that organic matter less appealing to the microbes. That would be something like biochar. It's microbes, if there's anything else there, that's what they're going to eat first. The biochar they'll leave behind. Or we can also think about controlling conditions, thinking about moisture, temperature, and those are things that are generally less being managed to manage microbes. Those are more things that we would think about for irrigating for crop yield and that sort of thing. But that is sort of technically another tuning there. One of the other things that is true of microbes is also true of humans is the microbes in the soil like to breathe, right? So they like having a lot of oxygen because that allows them to use more efficient metabolisms to consume that organic matter. And just like we need oxygen, if you oxygenate the soil more, the microbes are going to speed up. And so basically that's one of the reasons that it's already been mentioned, tillage is one of the ways, reducing tillage is a way that we can increase soil carbon storage. And basically what's happening there is when we till the soil, we're fluffing it up, we're breaking open soil aggregates, this sort of making organic matter available to microbes that wasn't previously available. And we're kind of introducing this oxygen so they can decompose it more rapidly. Whereas if we don't till, then the microbes are sort of just slowly munching away, and you might see that stock of carbon creeping up over time. So that's a little bit of sort of the science behind those soil carbon in general. And then, since it's come up a bit, just briefly on biochar. So biochar is an ancient practice. It's sort of maybe recently been people have sort of revisited its role in the Amazon as terra preta or dark earths, but there are actually dark earths all over the world. There are dark earths on the continent of Africa, on South America, North America, and as Gary mentioned, there's been the use of biochar within indigenous agriculture for a long time. And so when I say biochar, just briefly, what do I mean here? Biochar is essentially charcoal that is being produced intentionally, whether it's for carbon management or for as an agricultural amendment. So this is kind of, again, a systems level definition. Chemically, it's not necessarily fundamentally different from, say, the residues after a fire. And in fact, fire-based practices are some of the ways that Indigenous people have introduced biochar to the soils. And so just really briefly, why would we be thinking about this from a carbon management side of things? It's what I mentioned. So when it's being produced, of course, you have lots of carbon that's being released back into the atmosphere. But because it's incomplete combustion, there's also a lot of carbon that remains behind. And that carbon is relatively unappealing to microbes. So they decompose that carbon more slowly. It sticks around for hundreds and even thousands of years. And so that's one of the ways that we can sort of slow down the rate at which that carbon from biomass returns back to the atmosphere, keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere and in the soil. There's potential co-benefits to both biochar and increasing soil organic matter, which I think is one of the really exciting things in an agricultural context. If we're thinking about soil organic matter, of course, it's not just carbon, right? It comes along with the other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And as that organic matter decomposes, which we do want it to do to some extent, right? We don't want to just totally put a wrench in the system and totally shut down decomposition. But increasing organic matter overall in soils is going to increase nutrient availability generally. Along with that, we'll often see effects on water, water storage capacity, infiltration, that sort of thing. So that's one of the nice things about thinking about increasing soil organic matter from a carbon perspective, is that it has all these other reasons to do it as well. And with biochar, there can also be benefits. Again, it's going to depend sort of on the system, matching the right biochar to the right soil, thinking about what that biochar is going to offer, what that soil's requirements are, making sure those are in harmony is going to be important to making sure that one achieves the results that you'd want to see. But yeah, and then I guess, again, so just stepping back and thinking about it from a systems perspective, the last thing I'll just say on this is, if we think about, you might also say, okay, I've got biomass. Should I be, there's so many things that I can do with it. Should I be turning it into biochar? Should I be combusting it really efficiently as like a biofuel kind of system? Should I be letting it decompose as, more of a compost? And that's going to depend on your goals, right? Whether you're thinking number one about, just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether you're thinking more about trying to increase soil organic matter storage, which properties of that organic matter you're interested in, and then also the context in which that biomass is being managed. So if your number one goal is just reducing emissions, then a very efficient combustion might, and that places a really carbon intensive fuel like coal might have a greater climate impact than keeping it behind as biochar. But if what you're interested in is those co-benefits or potential effects in soil once it's added to soil, then you can see it being integrated into sort of a combined bioenergy biochar system. So I guess the main message there is that the system is really important, and it's important to think of it within the context of the broader system it's being applied in.
Yes, thank you, Thea. And Menominee, back in the day, the elders told us they used it specifically in sandy soils just to keep the nutrients in the water from leaching, that it could withhold that. So what she said. Okay, Becky, how can we incentivize practices that help promote adaptive, sustainable agriculture so they are equitable for every farmer, large or small, across Wisconsin?
So I'll be very brief on this one because I understand we're not supposed to get into too much of a discussion about the differences between taxes and I just spaced the word again. I always space this word, where you get the financial incentives.
Cost share or
No.
subsidies?
Subsidies, thank you. And really who controls our government. So I'll just stop with that and then really think about what we can learn from these other more environmentally responsible practices, and really think about the shift away. And it's a difficult paradigm shift, because if we look at our traditional agricultural practices, I don't sell any of my seeds. I don't sell any of my produce. I barter and I trade. So there is no dollars involved with that. So I'm certainly not going to get wealthy off of what I do, but I do know that it heals our bodies and our minds. And that's what's really important. But that makes sense in our smaller scale, but farmers got mortgages to pay, right? We have to, we live in 2021 and we're doing it on a larger scale in many cases. So then you got to really think about the finances obviously have to play a factor into this. And I know the answer isn't as simple as we'll just put more money into some of these smaller programs, but maybe even if there was a way to increase the awareness of these programs, because I've been fortunate enough to have some good friends who tell me about them. So us as a small scale farmer, we've been able to take advantage of some EQIP and different CRP programs from the USDA. So we have a 1 acre pollinator habitat. We have about 2 acres of tree planting. We have our high tunnel. So all of those things are looking at the whole of our property and not just where we're putting our trees. They're looking at how everything interrelates with each other. We have berry bushes. We have all these different things. We're hoping to get more nut trees on our property. So everything works together in a way, and it's not this monocrop culture coming through and just blazing everything down to make room for just that one thing. Even if you want to try to have organic practices and do cover cropping, that's just not enough. I think we really need to shift the way we look at agriculture, and we need to think about how it's fitting into the larger picture instead of just the dollar signs.
Okay, Randy, let me switch that over to you, specifically talking about some of the incentives for the larger agricultural.
Sure, thank you. And the good news about some of these is they're not necessarily, size related. They can morph to address the needs based off of soil and water health. And in the beginning, and actually kudos to the Follette Institute, because this one is a nice bridge to the next question we're going to talk about. So well done. So I'll go back to where I started, which is our agency serves as a resource. We don't have a lot of money to solve problems, but what we do is, what I like to talk about, connecting the dots to the farmers on the ground with some of the programmatic staff that we have, the technical resource staff that we have, getting them connected to local county soil conservation staff. I keep going back to soil and water conservation because many of those practices have this co-benefit of also protecting the soil and sequestering carbon, all tremendous benefits. So here are some of those incentives that we talk about. So it usually goes through counties. It's cost share programs so that farmers can implement practices that improve their soil and water health and conservation efforts, and we believe carbon capture. Nutrient management programs so that they are using less inputs or the right inputs at the right time, at the right location in their operation. Those are really important things. And sometimes reducing inputs can actually lead to benefits for not only the soil and water health, but a farmer may determine that they can spend less on inputs and still, perhaps optimize their return as a result. I keep talking about the importance of soil and water conservation staff. Those are the boots on the ground to help farmers make some of those decisions and deliver some of those cost share programs that really benefit us all. I'm going to talk about a couple things that were proposed and have not, and I'm going to say yet, been implemented. Part of Governor Evers' climate change task force that I mentioned earlier when we started came up with dozens of recommendations, including about a half a dozen really solid recommendations for Wisconsin agriculture to be involved in some of these solutions. Some things that kind of were extrapolated from that is a nitrogen optimization program. Thea mentioned the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium kind of blend that we need in soils. Again, optimizing nitrogen, which means not using as much as perhaps we did before, saves farmers money, and it could potentially improve their bottom line over time. The governor proposed a nitrogen optimization pilot program in his budget. He also proposed a soil carbon pilot program, which would have kind of helped incentivize, getting back to Gary's question a little bit earlier, how can we incentivize farmers for getting involved in some of those carbon capture efforts, or if they're already implementing them, if they've already implemented them, finding ways to build on them, or in some cases compensate them for the activities that they're already doing to capture carbon and prevent greenhouse gases. So, well, those were two proposals that I hope that we can continue to build on, that the governor included in his budget. It was not included in the version that came back to him from the legislature, but what I would say is there's a lot we agree on when it comes to soil and water conservation efforts. And these are things that we hope to have some ongoing positive dialogue with the members of the legislature so that we can provide some of these incentives.
Okay, thank you. And again, kudos to Follette for basically leading that question that covered. Is there any more that you might want to speak to that question on how DATCAP in the state of Wisconsin are working cooperatively with farmers to implement soil, water, and climate solutions? I know you've touched on much of those already.
I have, and I was scribbling notes furiously as Becky and Thea were talking, because there were these great ancillary conversations. So I'll drop in a couple that I think are really important, and I may not have covered with my previous conversations. And here they are. So we've partnered with several organizations and councils to create producer-led carbon and ecosystem service pilot projects. They explore water quality, carbon, climate-related services, focusing on conservation practices using statewide promoted tools, some of those tools that I've already talked about. And those start typically at the local level. Our administrator of a division of Ag Resource Management is also a member of the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts Wiki, along with UW-Cal's and Nelson Institute faculty co-chair, Dr. Chris Kucharik. They are going to be putting out a report soon called Improving Climate Change Mitigation and Resiliency Across Wisconsin's Agriculture Industry. Long title. Please keep your eye out for it. It'll be a great compilation of some of those benefits. We also serve as an advisor to the Nature Conservancy on their National Climate Solutions Decision Support Tool Project. Again, working with others to develop tools that others can use. So I don't want to go on too much longer because I know we're getting towards the end, but I think we covered some of these other topics on the prior question.
Okay, thank you, Randy. So we have 5 more minutes before we move into the question, the audience question. And of course, Randy, I want to be appreciative of your time and respectful. You have a hard stop at 2:15.
I do, yes.
So we'll try to move this. So Thea, looking to the future, how can government entities at the state and or local level work cooperatively with farmers to reduce emissions and increase carbon storage on their farms?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess I should, the obvious caveat, I'm neither a state or local government nor a farmer myself. So what I can say from the perspective of a soil scientist, though, is, these approaches, I think, are most likely to work when there are co-benefits. And fortunately, with things like soil carbon, increasing soil carbon, nutrient management, there always are. And in the case of biochar, depending on the system, there can be as well. And so I guess just thinking about some of the elements that have already been touched on are, how to motivate or compensate farmers for their actions. There's a lot that farmers are already doing. How do we reward that in addition to, encouraging or supporting people to adopt additional practices that will result in these effects that we want to see. Sometimes if we look at this from, a very strict accounting perspectives, these can be really hard impacts to quantify. They're dispersed. There are many people involved in them. There's the potential to reverse them. We've introduced no-till. Okay, now we had to go back to tillage because we had a really bad weed year and this is an organic farm, right? Like there are reasons that people use these practices. And so that's where I think, thinking about how we can continue to provide that support to do these sort of climate neutral or negative practices is really important. And that's also where things like the UW-Madison Extension Program does a lot, and the state level extension program, right? So we have things like field days and demonstration sites where people can see, does this practice work here? Additionally, you see collaborative trials with farmers. So working closely with people using this actually on their own land. Farmers are scientists as well, right? They're constantly running these experiments on their farms, trying this one year, trying this the next year, having a little side plot where we try this. And if it works, we'll introduce it the next year. And so seeing ways of supporting and encouraging that through things like UW's extension work is another really big one. But yeah, just coming back to the soil, we think about sort of those 2 key practices. One is how can we increase what goes in? And that's going to be things we've talked about today, cover crops, intercropping, diversification of production systems, maintaining crop residues on the field, having manure where it should be as a nutrient source, not a source of pollution. And then on the other end, slowing down what comes out. So that's going to be, again, keeping the soil covered, reducing tillage, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot that can be done. And I think there are, there's a complex sort of interplay of roles between farmers and policy and hopefully also scientists as well.
Thank you. And finally, Randy, we come to our final question. And of course, as we're talking in the back, we understand that there's an anxiety of farmers regarding capital costs, loan payments, return on investment, at least in the early stages. Moving forward, where do you see the greatest opportunities for innovation in agriculture to address climate change?
Thanks, Gary. And I know we're getting close to our Q&A time, so I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. I'll break it down to 4 possible recommendations. And some of these stem from Governor Evers' climate change task force that I've mentioned a couple times today. Step one starts at the local level. Support local soil and water resource management efforts. That means getting some incentive dollars to farmers to work together on some practices that they can find solutions themselves, alongside county conservation staff, the boots on the ground that help them do that. Good news, that's something that the governor and the legislature agreed on. Yes, I said that. Agreed on this year during the budget. There was really good unified support for those kinds of things. We've made those investments both in the producer-led watershed grant program to farmers along with the county conservation staff. That's great. We need to make sure we're keeping our eyes on the long term and make more investments down the line if we need to. Recommendation 2, engage farmers with a soil carbon storage in agriculture and working lands. It's a big topic. I won't dive into that greatly because I think Thea did a great job of covering that just now. Recommendation 3, avoid conversion of natural working farmlands. This is going to be key. We've all seen what's happened out west, drought, wildfires, and there are some severe long-term impacts that we're seeing to parts of our country that are major food producing areas. Another major food producing area, the Midwest. Wisconsin is blessed to have the climate, the access to soil, the rich productive land that it does. We need to make sure we're doing all we can to conserve that farmland, preserve that farmland, and preserve the soil that's part of that farmland from now and long into the future. Because if we see long-term impacts to areas of our country that have historically been major producers of food, there's going to be more and more pressure on places like the Midwest to kind of carry the ball on that. So we need to be keeping our eyes on the long-term plan, which is making sure we're preserving our working farmlands. And then recommendation 4 is add in items like managed grazing for livestock. We see that happen. What's old is new. What used to be kind of commonplace, animals grazing on the countryside is becoming more of a concept for not only a feed and nutrient perspective from the farmer, but also for the soil conservation benefits and carbon sequestration benefits. So there we go. 4 quick ones. There's many more, but those are the ones I wanted to focus on.
Thank you.
Yes.
So now we come to the audience question time. So
we have some online questions to start with. We have a lot of people watching online.
All right.
Thank you so much. And I'll start with questions kind of directed to Randy here. So this person asks, what are the possibilities for carbon markets in Wisconsin, and how can carbon markets be designed to benefit those who have been disproportionately harmed? And then they say by Department of Agriculture's history of discriminatory practices. So.
Okay, so I'll focus a little bit on the carbon component. I mentioned the carbon pilot project that Governor Evers proposed in his budget that was not approved by the legislature. But again, I put that into the category of we have opportunities to have some ongoing discussions to see if we can find some common ground on that. At the federal level, Secretary Vilsack has mentioned pretty repeatedly that he wants to establish a carbon bank, whether it's through a federal mechanism or some others. There is more and more interest expressed among Wisconsin farmers about what that would look like if they get into a carbon program. So I think there is interest, and I think people see it as not only valuable from it's the right thing to do, but I think once you get into the carbon market, there's also some potential economic benefit as well for doing the right thing.
Can I add a piece to that? Yeah, just I think one of the interesting things about carbon markets, especially thinking about soils, as I've mentioned, people are working towards ways of robustly integrating soils and land management into carbon accounting schemes. And it can be really challenging because, again, they're very dispersed. We need to think about aggregation of credits, that sort of thing. And so this is one interesting case where sometimes integrating these types of approaches as offset mechanisms in some ways can be really appealing when they're done in outside of a formal carbon market. So I guess what I'm saying is if you have, or I guess I should say the voluntary market is an interesting place for them to start, because when they're integrated into like a formalized non-voluntary market or a government level market, you run the risk of, if you miscount or if it turns out that the soil didn't behave the way you expected it to, well, someone out there has gone ahead and polluted with carbon because they were counting on those emissions, right? Whereas if you're in a voluntary context, there was going to be no offset to begin with, and so anything that you get is going to be a benefit. And I guess just also thinking about, so some of my work in my master's degree was outside of the Wisconsin context, but I'm working on things like cook stoves in Western Kenya that could be used to produce biochar and also use heat for cooking at the same time. And it was an interesting system because I think the question had an element of social justice to it as well. And certainly we don't want to be, manipulating the lives of the people who are most vulnerable to climate change and often the least responsible, just so the global north can go on emitting, right? And so that's another reason that any of these policies that begin to be integrated need to have benefits beyond just we're getting carbon out of the atmosphere. There need to be these co-benefits and a reason for doing that beyond just the climate change impacts themselves.
Yes, and finally, I might pitch in. Menominee had looked at this also with our forest, with our sustained forest, and we were told we might be the largest single owner of probably the largest sequestration of a single owner, and the funding was there regarding the cap and trade. But as we vetted it, you always do that thinking systemically from our point of view. But if we're looking at cap and trade, eventually that's coming back. So we said no, unless there was a negative sequestration, and this would not do that. Others are just being allowed to do that based off what we already do. So.
And I would just add, I'm glad Thea mentioned the social justice component, given the end of that question. Because I think social justice was one of the key components of the climate change task force that Gary and I sat on. It was important for us to give voice to those concepts and develop best practices and recommendations moving forward. The thing that I would say about the programs for the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection is, number one, we don't have a lot of program funding. We're not the USDA, which has a lot more money available to it. So what we provide are resources and technical assistance. And what I would say from our perspective is we make sure that those are available to anybody who needs them, regardless of where they live or what size operation or what type of operation.
Thank you, Reddy. Are there others?
Yeah. I'd like to cross-fertilize with the session earlier this morning on electricity and regulation and utilities. Jackson Keith, who was one of the speakers, mentioned that in order to achieve the level of renewable energy that the state needs, we need about 35 times more land than it's currently allocated to renewable energy. And so I couldn't help but notice when Randy mentioned the importance of avoiding conversion of the agricultural land that's currently under that we currently have. And so I'm just wondering how, if you would have some observations about how we navigate the need to have more renewable energy, which requires land, and this question of avoiding conversion. Thank you.
If that's directed to me, I'll start off with the quick answer, which is how do we do that carefully? There's more to it than that. It is clear we do need to develop a more renewable energy stock in the state of Wisconsin. We've seen that develop over time, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for our climate. It's also a good thing for Wisconsin because we, among the many things we have opportunities for is the wind blows and the sun shines in the state of Wisconsin, just like it does in many other places. So we need to look at opportunities to do that. it is also important that we recognize that there are some really important lands that are available to producing food that we need to have long-term plans. What's the vision for those parcels, those areas long-term? We do have farmland preservation programs in the state of Wisconsin. We have a program called the Agriculture Enterprise Area, which does its best to kind of contain and I don't want to use the word conglomerate, but it contains and then helps agricultural businesses within an area continue to practice as agricultural programs and businesses from now and into the future by signing farmland preservation agreements. What they get out of it is it's kind of a economic cluster for agriculture, and there are many of them in the state that kind of help with that farmland preservation, farmland conservation efforts. So we just need to utilize those kinds of programs at the same time as we look at renewable energies. So that gets back to where I started, which is we have to make sure we're doing that carefully and thoughtfully as we move forward.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Hopefully a question, and hopefully down front, we've had his hand up since we started. Yes, question, please.
Okay, the incentives and resources that you all have been citing has been wonderful. I'm wondering though as well if there are concrete policies that would be enforceable that have been integrated into our system, especially as our knowledge and awareness of these practices and their impact has grown lately, just as far as what is actually being implemented and allowed for farming practices in the state.
Want me to take that? Okay, sure. So yeah, there are a lot of programs that we've talked about today. I think some of them are in existence, some of them are proposed, and we're hopeful to see some of them happen down the line. A lot of the ones that I've talked about are, especially as it relates to the soil and water conservation programs and nutrient management programs, provide the benefit of resources as cost share to implement practices that benefit us all. And that's a lot of the programming that we take effect. We're a regulatory agency, but our regulatory components are typically more of like an inspection of operations as opposed to, for instance, we don't license CAFOs. Sometimes people think that we do. So we take our steps as the resource approach that I've been talking about. Technical assistance from our staff to whoever's trying to implement practices that will make a difference, and the benefit that we can provide are incentive-based cost share opportunities.
Yes, and we've also found that some of the funding that has come forward via policy that has come forward has allowed for food system development on a local level. And we've found those types of assistance not only is going to help us today by reducing some of the emissions that we get from transportation and everything else, but we also know that we're seeing some terrible things coming from the Southwest and the West and some of the climate concerns, and we need to bolster this area. So the indigenous tribes are really working to create those types of models, and not only just from indigenous growers, but also from others who grow organically or who grow in an organic fashion, but do not have that ability, the extra funding to truly be organic. So we've seen some of those pushes, and of course, you've backed all of those types of movements, and that the policy piece comes from some of the funding that we know we've seen. So we have time for one very last question.
We get one. We just have so many questions. Okay, thank you.
So Miki asks, are these tactics such as no-till, cover crops, etc., useful only on a large scales at big farms, or are they impactful / necessary on the individual level in our own backyard gardens and community garden plots? I know you touched on this a little bit already.
I can give a really quick answer to that. And the answer is they're absolutely not limited to large scale. That's the amazing thing about the land. You know, it's managed on a very small level that it can be influenced on at a very small level. So if you're talking about enriching organic matter on your own garden through composting and that sort of thing, that's an awesome place to start, and to start at home.
And that is our practices on our farmstead. And our goal is to have no bare soil anywhere, except maybe the tiny space around the seeds until they can get up to a certain height, till we can put some hay around them or some straw. So definitely on the smaller scale as well. It has so many benefits of rejuvenating the soil, reducing runoff. It keeps the shape of the mounds to help improve the water issues that could possibly happen. So we definitely do that on a smaller scale.
Thank you. So sorry to say, we've come to an end. I would like to thank our panelists, Thea, Rebecca, Randy, for what they have done. And thank you, the Follette Institute, for this great opportunity to be here. And we ask you all to please, we encourage you to fill out the post-event survey on goalwith.edu/climate policy. And let's see if we can increase his grade level on his, right, he's a graduate from here. Let's try to increase his grades. We'll go and revisit your grades.
The good news is I already made it through. But, you know.
So he don't care. Well, thank you all. This is a very, very serious session, and we do take it serious. Please, we are not trying to be flippant with any of these. What one of our full-blood Menominee elders would say when she come to something like this and saw the questions and the concerns, I'm always reminded of that. She would say, "Mani kako awe." That means this is a really good thing. So that's what it is. And I know she's watching from up there, and we thank you all for being here and taking this serious, and please help us push this forward as much as we can. Thank you all for being here.